looking at my father's smirk as he prepared to hand everything to my brother. I never imagined that 15 years of sacrifice were about to be validated in the most unexpected way. My name is Amanda Johnson, and this is the story of how a family inheritance reveal turned my world completely upside down. For as long as I can remember, I was the useless child in my father Richard's eyes. While my older brother Michael was praised for every small achievement, I was constantly reminded of my shortcomings. When our mother passed away when I was 19, I made what I thought was a noble decision. I would stay home and take care of our family. I dropped out of college in my sophomore year, abandoning my dreams of becoming a nurse. Instead, I worked double shifts at a local diner to help pay for Michael's education. Every morning at 5 a.m, I'd wake up to prepare breakfast for Dad before heading to my first job. After 8 hours of serving customers, I'd rush home to cook dinner, do laundry, and make sure Dad had everything he needed. Amanda's just not college material anyway, Dad would tell his friends when they asked about my future. Some people are meant to serve others. That's her purpose. His words stung, but I convinced myself he was just being practical. Someone had to hold the family together. While I was scrubbing floors and washing dishes, Michael was living the college experience I'd given up. Spring breaks in Florida, fraternity parties, study abroad programs, all funded by my minimum wage earnings and Dad's social security. When Michael graduated with his business degree, Dad threw him a huge party. When I got promoted to shift manager at the diner after 3 years, Dad barely looked up from his newspaper. The pattern continued into our 30s. I never dated seriously because Dad always found something wrong with any man I brought home. "You can't abandon family for some stranger," he'd guilt me. "Your mother would be disappointed." So I stayed single, devoted, and increasingly isolated from people my own age. Michael, meanwhile, married his college sweetheart and moved to the suburbs. He'd visit occasionally, usually when he needed money. Dad would slip him hundreds from the envelope where I kept the household cash, never asking questions. When I protested, Dad would snap, "He's building a future. You're just existing." Looking back now, I can identify 5 major warning signs that I completely missed at the time. The first was financial manipulation. Dad controlled every penny that came into our house, but somehow Michael always had access to funds for his various ventures. When I asked about the missing money from our grocery budget, Dad would say, "Your brother has important opportunities. You wouldn't understand." The second red flag was emotional blackmail. Whenever I mentioned wanting to take a class or maybe move into my own apartment, Dad would mysteriously develop new health problems. "The doctor says my heart can't handle stress," he'd wheeze dramatically. "If something happens to me because you abandoned our family, how will you live with yourself?" These mysterious ailments always disappeared once I backed down from my plans. The third pattern was the classic golden child versus scapegoat dynamic. Michael could do no wrong, even when he lost 3 jobs in 2 years, or when his business ventures failed spectacularly. "He's ambitious," Dad would defend. "He's not afraid to take risks." But when I suggested maybe we should budget more carefully, or when I questioned Dad's spending habits, I was negative and small-minded. The fourth warning sign was constant gaslighting. Dad had an incredible ability to rewrite history. When I'd remind him of the sacrifices I'd made, he'd look genuinely confused. What sacrifices? You chose to stay home. No one forced you. When I'd point out how much money I'd contributed to Michael's education, Dad would shake his head sadly. You have such a victim mentality, Amanda. It's not attractive. The final red flag was information control. Dad handled all the family paperwork, all the legal documents, all the financial decisions. When I'd ask about insurance policies or estate planning, he'd wave me off. That's not your concern. Focus on what you do best, taking care of daily things. I now realise he was deliberately keeping me in the dark about crucial family matters. The psychological impact of growing up as the scapegoat child created deep patterns in my thinking. I developed chronic self-doubt, always second-guessing my perceptions and decisions. I became a people-pleaser, desperate to avoid conflict, because confrontation meant risking the little approval I occasionally received. Setting boundaries felt impossible, because any assertion of my needs was met with withdrawal of affection or threats of abandonment. Most damaging was the confusion about my own identity. For so long, I defined myself only in relation to what others needed from me. I was a caregiver, a provider, a solution to other people's problems, but I had no sense of who Amanda actually was underneath all those roles. The years blended together in a cycle of work, caregiving, and quiet resentment that I pushed down because good daughters don't feel angry at their families. I watched friends from high school get married, have children, build careers, travel the world, while I remained frozen in a 19-year-old's decision to sacrifice everything for family loyalty. By the time I reached 35, I was exhausted. Not just physically tired from working multiple jobs to support our household, but emotionally drained from years of feeling invisible and unappreciated. My back ached from constantly bending over to accommodate everyone else's needs. My bank account was always empty because family needs came first. My social circle had shrunk to co-workers and the regular customers at the diner who knew me as that sweet girl who works so hard. But what I didn't know, what none of us knew, was that someone had been watching all those years. Someone had been taking careful notes about family dynamics, about who truly cared for others and who simply took advantage. Someone had been making plans that would change everything. The call came on a Tuesday morning in October. Dad's lawyer, Mr. Thompson, needed to schedule a family meeting. Your father wants to finalise his estate planning, he explained over the phone. He'd like everyone present, you, Michael, and a few other family members as witnesses. My stomach dropped. Dad had been talking more frequently about getting his affairs in order lately, but he'd always brushed off my questions about the details. Now, apparently, it was happening whether I was prepared or not. The night before the meeting, I barely slept. I kept thinking about all the times Dad had made it clear that Michael was the favoured son, the one with potential, the one who deserved investment and support. If Dad was formalising his wishes legally, I knew what that meant for my future. The morning of the meeting, I dressed carefully in my only good outfit, a navy blue dress I'd bought for Michael's wedding 3 years earlier. My hand shook as I applied mascara, and I had to stop twice because tears kept blurring my vision. Something about this day felt final, like a door was about to close forever on any hope I'd harboured that Dad might eventually recognise my contributions to our family. The law office was intimidating, all dark wood and leather-bound books that made me feel small and out of place. Michael arrived 10 minutes late, looking confident in his expensive suit and designer watch. He kissed my cheek perfunctorily and shook hands with our father like they were business partners rather than family members. "Sorry I'm late," Michael announced to the room. Conference call with some investors ran long. He said it loud enough for everyone to hear, a subtle reminder of his important professional life compared to my service industry job. Dad beamed with pride. "That's my son, always closing deals." He glanced at me sitting quietly in the corner chair. "Amanda got here early, of course. She's always been reliable." The way he said reliable made it sound like a character flaw rather than a virtue. Reliable like furniture, reliable like a tool that serves its purpose without requiring attention or appreciation. Mr. Thompson cleared his throat and began arranging papers on his mahogany desk. The room fell silent, except for the ticking of an antique clock on the wall. Dad sat up straighter, clearly enjoying the formal atmosphere and the gravity of the moment. "We're here today," Mr. Thompson began in his measured legal voice, "to execute the last will and testament of Richard Johnson." He looked around the room at the small gathering, me, Michael, Dad, and 2 family friends serving as witnesses. My palms were sweating. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure everyone could hear it. This was it, the moment when Dad's feelings about his children would become legal fact, permanent and unchangeable. Dad was practically glowing with self-importance as Mr. Thompson began reading the formal legal language. Through the complex terminology, the basic message became clear. The house, the car, the savings account, the small life insurance policy, everything was going to Michael. Richard Johnson hereby leaves his entire estate to his son Michael Johnson, Mr. Thompson read in a neutral tone, with the understanding that Michael has demonstrated the capability and ambition necessary to build upon this foundation. The words hit me like a physical blow, not just the financial reality of being left with nothing, but the public declaration that I was worth nothing. That 15 years of devotion, sacrifice, and care meant nothing. That I had no value to my father beyond my usefulness as a caretaker and financial contributor. But the worst part wasn't even the will itself. It was what happened next. Dad turned to me with a smirk that I'd seen countless times over the years, the expression he wore when he was about to deliver what he considered a life lesson. "Amanda, honey," he said in a patronizing tone, "don't look so surprised. Michael deserves this inheritance because he's actually done something with his life. He's ambitious, he takes risks, he has a future ahead of him." The room was dead silent. Even the witnesses looked uncomfortable, but Dad wasn't finished. "You've been comfortable just existing," he continued, his voice getting louder and more confident. "Working your little waitress job, living in my house, never really challenging yourself. This money would be wasted on someone like you. Michael will invest it, grow it, make something meaningful out of it." Then came the words that are burned into my memory forever. "You're a useless child, Amanda. You always have been. They deserve it. You don't." The humiliation was overwhelming. Being disinherited was painful enough, but being publicly mocked and dismissed in front of witnesses made it 1,000 times worse. I felt my face burning with shame, my vision blurring with tears. I was desperate not to shed in front of everyone. Michael didn't even have the decency to look embarrassed by Dad's cruelty. He just nodded along, as if Dad's assessment was perfectly reasonable. As if my years of sacrifice meant nothing, as if I really was just a useless burden who had contributed nothing to our family. I wanted to run from that room. I wanted to disappear and never face any of these people again. The pain was so sharp and immediate that I could barely breathe, much less form words to defend myself. But just as Dad reached for the pen to sign the final documents, just as Michael started to smile, his victory smile, something extraordinary happened. Mr. Thompson cleared his throat in a way that made everyone stop and look at him. He was holding a different set of papers, and his expression had shifted from neutral professionalism to something that looked almost like anticipation. "Actually," he said, his voice cutting through the silence like a knife, "there's something you should know." The silence in that law office was deafening. Dad's pen froze halfway to the paper. Michael's confident smile wavered, and every eye in the room turned to Mr. Thompson. The elderly lawyer was holding a manila envelope that seemed to glow with importance in the afternoon light streaming through his office windows. "I have here," Mr. Thompson continued, his voice steady and authoritative, "a second legal document that significantly impacts today's proceedings. This is a trust fund established by the late Eleanor Johnson, your grandmother, Amanda, 5 years ago." My heart stopped. Grandmother Eleanor had passed away 2 years earlier, but she had been the one person in our family who had ever truly seen me. While Dad dismissed my efforts, and Michael ignored my existence, Grandma Eleanor had always made time to listen to my dreams and validate my feelings. Mr. Thompson opened the envelope with deliberate care. "Mrs. Eleanor Johnson came to my office in 2019, shortly after observing what she described as troubling family dynamics during your mother's funeral arrangements. She was quite specific about her intentions." Dad's face had gone pale. "That's impossible. Mother never mentioned any separate arrangements to me." "She specifically requested that you not be informed," Mr. Thompson replied calmly. "She wanted to ensure that her final wishes would be carried out without interference or manipulation." My hands were trembling as Mr. Thompson began reading from the trust document. The legal language was complex, but the meaning was crystal clear. Grandmother Eleanor had established a trust fund worth $500,000 plus the deed to her house and property, to be inherited solely by my granddaughter Amanda Johnson, who has demonstrated through years of selfless service the true meaning of family devotion. The room erupted in chaos. Dad shot to his feet, his face red with fury. "This is ridiculous. Mother was senile in her final years. She didn't understand what she was doing." Michael's mouth was hanging open in shock. "Wait, what? Amanda gets $500,000. There has to be some mistake." But Mr. Thompson wasn't finished reading. The trust document specifically states that these funds are designated for the granddaughter who sacrificed her education, her career prospects, and her personal happiness to care for family members, asking for nothing in return. I felt like I was floating outside of my own body. This couldn't be real. People like me, people who spent their lives serving others, didn't suddenly inherit life-changing money. There had to be some catch, some condition that would snatch this miracle away. Furthermore, Mr. Thompson continued, seemingly immune to the chaos around him, Mrs. Johnson included detailed instructions that this inheritance should only be revealed after Mr. Richard Johnson had made his own will public, so that Amanda could see the contrast between how different family members value her contributions. The implications hit me like a physical blow. Grandmother Eleanor hadn't just left me money, she had orchestrated this entire moment. She had wanted me to experience the full pain of Dad's rejection before discovering that someone had been watching. Someone had been keeping score. Someone had recognized my worth all along. Dad was pacing behind his chair now, his voice rising with each word. This is manipulation. Mother was trying to control us from beyond the grave. That money should be part of the family estate. I'm afraid that's not legally possible, Mr. Thompson said, maintaining his professional composure despite the emotional storm swirling around his office. The trust was properly executed and notarized. It's completely separate from Mr. Richard Johnson's estate and cannot be contested or altered. Michael leaned forward, his businessman instincts kicking in. Surely Amanda would want to share this windfall with her family, right? I mean, we're all in this together. His voice carried that familiar tone of assumed entitlement that I'd heard countless times when he needed money for his various failed ventures. For the first time in decades, I found my voice. No, I said quietly, but firmly enough that everyone heard. No, I don't think I will be sharing this inheritance. The look of shock on their faces was almost comical. They had never, not once in 35 years, heard me refuse a family request for money or assistance. Mr. Thompson reached back into the envelope and pulled out a sealed letter with my name written in Grandmother Eleanor's familiar handwriting. She also left this personal message for you, Amanda. With shaking hands, I opened the letter and began reading silently. But after the first few lines, I realized that everyone else deserved to hear this too. They needed to understand exactly what Grandmother Eleanor had observed and documented over the years. My dearest Amanda, I read aloud, my voice growing stronger with each word. If you're hearing this letter, it means I am gone, and it also means that your father has just shown his true colours in front of witnesses. I want you to know that I have been watching and taking notes for years. I paused, looking around the room at the stunned faces of my family members. I watched you drop out of college to care for our family without complaint. I watched you work double shifts to pay for your brother's education while he partied his way through university. I watched you give up relationships, friendships, and personal dreams because your father convinced you that family duty was more important than personal happiness. Dad tried to interrupt, but I held up my hand and continued reading. I also watched your father take credit for your sacrifices while simultaneously diminishing your worth. I watched him praise Michael for achievements that were funded by your labour. I watched him gaslight you into believing that your perceptions of unfair treatment were just victim mentality. The silence in the room was profound now. Even the witnesses seemed riveted by Grandmother Eleanor's posthumous testimony. Most importantly, Amanda, I watched you maintain your kindness and integrity despite years of emotional abuse. You never became bitter or cruel in response to cruel treatment. You never stopped caring for others, even when no one seemed to care for you. That is why you deserve not just this inheritance, but a completely fresh start in life. I folded the letter carefully, feeling a strength I hadn't experienced in years flowing through my body. Grandmother Eleanor hadn't just left me money. She had left me validation, documentation, and most importantly, permission to finally put myself first. Over the following weeks, the family's reaction to my inheritance revealed everything I needed to know about their true character. Within hours of leaving the lawyer's office, my phone started ringing non-stop. Dad called 17 times that first evening, alternating between rage and manipulation. "You're being selfish, Amanda," he accused during one particularly heated conversation. "Family means sharing resources. Your grandmother would be disgusted by your greed." When guilt didn't work, he tried threats. "If you don't share that money, you're no longer welcome in this house. See how well you do on your own after I've supported you all these years." The irony was stunning. After decades of telling me I was worthless and useless, he was now claiming credit for supporting me, even though I had been financially supporting him for over a decade. Michael's approach was more calculated. He showed up at the diner where I worked with a business proposal folder, acting as if nothing unusual had happened at the lawyer's office. "Amanda, I've been thinking," he said, sliding into my section during my lunch shift. "This inheritance is a great opportunity for both of us. I've got this investment opportunity that could double your money within 2 years." When I politely declined, his mask slipped completely. "You don't know anything about money management, Amanda. You've never made a financial decision bigger than which brand of cereal to buy. You're going to waste it all, and then you'll come crying to family for help." The most revealing reactions came from extended family members who had never shown much interest in my life before. Suddenly, cousins I hadn't heard from in years were calling with urgent family emergencies that required immediate financial assistance. Aunts who had barely acknowledged my existence were inviting me to lunch to discuss family investments. But the harassment campaign that truly opened my eyes involved my father's attempt to turn our church community against me. Dad had always been active in our local church, and he began telling anyone who would listen that I had stolen money that rightfully belonged to the whole family. "Amanda has forgotten her Christian values," he told our pastor during a counselling session I later learned about. "She's putting money before family, greed before love. Her mother would be heartbroken." What Dad didn't anticipate was that many people in our community had been watching our family dynamics for years, just as Grandmother Eleanor had. They had noticed who showed up to volunteer for every church function, who visited elderly members when they were sick, who quietly helped families in need without seeking recognition. Mrs. Patterson, who had known our family for 20 years, pulled me aside after Sunday service one week. "Honey," she said gently, "don't let anyone make you feel guilty about that inheritance. We've all seen how hard you've worked and how little appreciation you've received. Your grandmother knew exactly what she was doing." Similar conversations began happening everywhere I went. The pharmacist who had watched me pick up Dad's medications for years, the grocery store manager who had seen me carefully budget our family's food expenses, the bank teller who had processed countless money transfers from my account to Michael's. They all had observed the truth of our family's financial dynamics. Meanwhile, I was quietly meeting with financial advisors and lawyers to protect my inheritance and plan for my future. The first thing I did was move the money into accounts that only I could access. The second thing was to hire a therapist who specialized in family trauma and manipulation. Dr. Sarah Mitchell helped me understand concepts I'd never heard before: emotional abuse, financial exploitation, scapegoating, and trauma bonding. For the first time in my life, I had professional validation that what I had experienced wasn't normal family dynamics, but a pattern of psychological manipulation that had damaged my sense of self-worth and personal agency. Amanda, Dr. Mitchell explained during one of our early sessions, you've been conditioned to believe that your value as a person depends entirely on what you can provide for others. That's why setting boundaries feels so terrifying. It challenges the core identity that was imposed on you. Through therapy, I began to understand that my father's treatment of me wasn't random or deserved. It was a systematic pattern designed to keep me dependent and available to serve his needs. The constant criticism kept my self-esteem low enough that I wouldn't seek opportunities outside the family. The financial control kept me economically trapped. The emotional manipulation kept me believing that I owed them my entire life in exchange for basic family membership. 6 months after the inheritance revelation, I made the decision to move out of my father's house for the first time in my adult life. Using part of grandmother Eleanor's money, I purchased a small but beautiful condo across town, far enough away to establish independence, close enough to maintain some family connection if genuine reconciliation ever became possible. The day I moved out was both terrifying and exhilarating. Dad stood in the doorway of his house, watching the movers load my belongings into the truck, but he didn't say a word. Michael wasn't there at all. He had apparently decided that if I wasn't going to share my inheritance, I wasn't worth his time. But as I drove away from that house for the last time as a resident, I felt something I hadn't experienced in decades: freedom, not just financial freedom, although that was certainly life-changing, but emotional and psychological freedom. For the first time in my adult life, I could make decisions based on what I wanted rather than what others needed from me. The transformation wasn't immediate or easy. 35 years of conditioning don't disappear overnight. I still caught myself apologizing for things that weren't my fault, still felt guilty when I spent money on myself instead of others, still hesitated to express opinions that might create conflict. But gradually, with therapy and the support of friends I was finally free to cultivate, I began to discover who Amanda Johnson actually was underneath all those years of imposed identity. I learned that I loved reading mystery novels, something I'd never had time for when every spare moment was devoted to family obligations. I discovered a talent for photography that blossomed when I finally had the freedom to explore creative interests. Most importantly, I learned that I was capable of forming healthy, reciprocal relationships with people who valued my thoughts and feelings as much as my willingness to help them. For the first time, I experienced friendships where care and support flowed in both directions. A year after moving out, I received an unexpected phone call. Dad was in the hospital with pneumonia, and Michael was asking if I would help with his care. the old Amanda would have dropped everything and rushed to his bedside, ready to sacrifice whatever was necessary to prove my family loyalty. The new Amanda made a different choice. I arranged for professional home health care, paid for it with my inheritance money, and visited Dad twice during his recovery. Not as his devoted caretaker, but as a daughter maintaining appropriate boundaries with a father who had never learned to treat her with respect. "Why won't you come stay with me while I recover?" Dad asked during one of those visits. "I need family around me, not strangers." "You have professional care that's much better qualified than I am," I replied calmly, "and I have my own life to live now." He looked genuinely confused by this response, as if the concept of me having independent priorities was incomprehensible. But for the first time, his confusion didn't make me feel guilty. It made me feel grateful to Grandmother Eleanor for giving me the resources to finally break free, and grateful to myself for having the courage to use that freedom wisely. Today, 3 years after that life-changing day in Mr. Thompson's office, my life looks completely different. I use part of the inheritance to go back to school and finally earn my nursing degree. I now work at a paediatric hospital, helping children and families navigate medical crises with the same caregiving instincts that once trapped me, but now employed in a professional context where my contributions are recognised and fairly compensated. I've travelled to places I never thought I'd see, formed friendships with people who knew nothing about my family, history, and even started dating, something I never thought would be possible after decades of being told I was too damaged and dependent to attract a healthy partner. The relationship with my father and brother remains complicated but manageable. We see each other occasionally at family gatherings, where they treat me with a cautious respect that acknowledges the shift in family power dynamics. I'm no longer the desperate to please daughter who can be manipulated with guilt and threats. I'm an independent adult woman who chooses her level of family involvement based on how she's treated. Sometimes people ask me if I feel guilty about keeping Grandmother Eleanor's inheritance instead of sharing it with family members who still believe they deserved part of it. The answer is no, not anymore. That money wasn't just a financial gift. It was a recognition of worth that had been denied to me my entire life. It was validation that my sacrifices mattered, that my character had been observed and valued, that someone had been keeping score even when it felt like no one was paying attention. Most importantly, it was the tool that finally allowed me to build the life I deserved. A life where my value as a person isn't dependent on what I can provide for others, but on the inherent worth that Grandmother Eleanor saw in me all along. And that, I've learned, is the most precious inheritance of all.